Okay, there we go. If you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself in the chat. It's amazing to see where everybody's tuning in from. Such a true pleasure. If you do feel comfortable turning on your camera, please do so, because we love to see your faces. But if there are any privacy concerns, again, please turn off your camera and change your name label, especially if you're in a place where there have been issues with the government. Before I begin, I just want to note that this is being recorded and will be distributed widely. So again, please just be judicious about your name label and your camera. We are stuck using Zoom because we had such incredible interest in the conference, which we're really happy about, but we do acknowledge all the security issues that Zoom is notorious for, so we apologize, but we are trying our best under these constraints. Of course, this is a space for collaboration and kindness, so we ask that everybody show respect. We have just one basic rule, which is don't be a jerk, and this rule will be enforced by our moderators. So thanks for that. If you have any concerns or questions, you can direct message me directly, or Promise, or Vincent. And I think we'll get started in just a minute here. Okay. So welcome everyone to the opening panel of the Transnationally Asian Conference. It's a special honor for me to be here. My name is Tammy Kim, and I'm a freelance magazine writer and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. I'm currently based in Montana, and I feel super privileged that the conference title and concept were inspired in part by an essay I wrote in July in the Columbia Journalism Review. The purpose of that essay was to draw a line between the three activist outlets that are hosting this conference today: New Naratif, New Bloom, and Lausan, which I was reading a lot and admiring, especially during the pandemic. And in that piece, what I was interested in this concept of transnationally Asian, was to describe how these activist media outlets, these collectives, were able to capture an anti-nationalist and internationalist perspective across Asia and in the Asian diaspora. As you read these outlets, you see that in their articles, but also their events and their protests, all of their organizing, there's a desire to explore what's shared between working people, rather than comparing whose government is best or engaging in the sorts of nationalisms that have been so destructive. I celebrate the recognition of many sorts of diasporas, not just from Asia to the West, the traditional way, but within Asia, around Asia, and in other parts of the world. They're interested not only in immigrant narratives, but temporary sojourns, reverse migrations, and bi and tricultural realities. So here we are. It's so exciting to see people from all over the world to celebrate these three outlets and the incredible labor that goes on behind them. In this first panel of the conference, we have a representative of each of the three. Minxi Chua is here from New Naratif, which covers and organizes Southeast Asia. Brian Hioe is here with New Bloom in Taiwan. And Ah Boat, a pseudonym, which we'll get into in a bit, is here from Lausan, which focuses on Hong Kong, but not only Hong Kong. I'll ask each presenter to speak for about 7 minutes each, and then we'll have some Q&A. Please type your questions into the chat, and we'll be collecting them through the conference. We plan to finish within an hour, so to maximize the time, we'll just pick a few of those questions and go from there. But for those who can stay beyond the hour, we're going to have kind of a more free discussion where we can unmute and get into some of the issues that this conference hopes to address. So without further ado, let's begin with Minxi Chua of New Naratif. Minxi is a Malaysian writer, filmmaker, and organizer who works as New Naratif's operations manager. She's currently working on a novel about mental illness, intergenerational trauma, and Malaysian witches, which I'm very excited about. Over to you, Minxi.
Thanks so much, Tammy. I just want to say as well, thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you so much for believing in this event. The response has been so exciting for us, and it's actually been kind of unbelievable, the amount of people who have signed up and become a part of this conference. And I really hope that it's the first of many to come. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I'm going to share my screen now and do my presentation. So give me a moment, slightly Zoom challenged, as a few of us here may be. Okay, is it sharing now, everybody? Yes? Okay, great. So again, hi, my name is Minxi Chua, pronoun she, her, and I'm here today representing New Naratif. Some quick background info on me. I'm usually based in KL, but I'm currently living in Hong Kong because of some COVID-related personal issues. But I'm both a Malaysian national and a Hong Kong permanent resident. So this issue of being transnationally Asian is pretty relevant to me on a personal level as well. As Tammy said, I'm a fiction writer and a documentary filmmaker. And in terms of my activism, I'm very involved in the psychosocial disability movement, as well as the labor rights movement in Malaysia. Now, a bit about New Naratif for those who may not know us. We are a media and advocacy organization based in Southeast Asia. We cover news from around the whole region, and we consider ourselves a movement for democracy, freedom of expression, and freedom of information. I am the operations manager at New Naratif, and that means I'm basically in charge of running the day-to-day operations for the whole team. I'm also in charge of organizational security and human resources. And on top of all of that, I do occasionally write articles for the site, I contribute to social media and marketing, and I get to organize events like this conference. So that's pretty much all there is about me. Now, when Tammy kind of asked us to conceptualize this panel, she was asking us about, some things that we find to be important about our outlet as a journalism platform, as well as a vehicle for political and social change. So when I was thinking about this prompt, a few things came to mind for me. And the very first thing was the way we transcend borders as a media platform. So as Southeast Asians, we're really trained to think in nationalistic terms about our region, often to the point of antagonism towards our neighbors, which is really unfortunate. And local media outlets, unfortunately, also tend to reflect this way of thinking. But it's quite arbitrary because this is a region that's always been defined by movement and hybridity across national borders. And just being a part of New Naratif as a real, regional platform has made this hybridity very clear to me. I've learned so much from my fellow New Naratif team members who are from all around Southeast Asia and who bring so much understanding of their local context to our work, which actually in turn helps me to understand my own context even better. And I like to think that our stories similarly expand the intellectual horizons of our readers, as well as their political aspirations for a more empathetic and less hyper-nationalistic Southeast Asia. So that's the first thing I really thought of when I was thinking about the importance of New Naratif to the media space in this region. So the second thing I started thinking of was the way that we transcend genre. And the way that we do this is we don't just publish, traditional journalism articles, which we do publish, but we also do research articles, comics, podcasts, and videos. And we publish in multiple Southeast Asian languages as well: Bahasa Indonesia, Chinese, Vietnamese, Khmer. And to us, this is an accessibility issue because we want our work to be as accessible as possible to as many Southeast Asians as possible. And in a region that's as ethnically and linguistically diverse as ours, this is not an easy task whatsoever. But no matter how imperfect, I think the attempt that we make is really worthy in of itself. And I want to bring up a specific example of a cross-genre piece that we recently published that I think succeeded in this task of really bringing in as many people as possible, and that I'm very proud of, which is a comic that we published about the 1963 Malaysia Agreement. So you can actually see the header of the comic here. It's incredibly beautiful art. And for those who don't know, the 1963 Malaysia Agreement is a piece of political legislation that's quite important. It's very important actually to many Malaysians who live in Malaysia, Borneo, but it's often overlooked by those of us who come from peninsular Malaysia, which is where most of the political and financial power of the country is concentrated. So when we were thinking about, how to execute this comic, our amazing comics and illustrations editor, she's absolutely brilliant. Her name is Karis Lok, and she's Malaysian. She wanted to make sure that we drew on Malaysian Borneo voices in order to bring this piece to life, which is exactly what we did. So you can see some images from the comic here. And the comic ended up being illustrated by a Sarawakian illustrator, written by a Sabahan researcher and academic. And it was actually translated into 3 Malaysian languages, including Bahasa Iban, which is an indigenous language. And I think I'm not alone in kind of saying this here, but Bahasa Iban is very rarely represented in media in Malaysia. And it's actually also gone on to become one of our most popular pieces on the site. It got 20,000 hits alone in September of this year. And I think that really proves that platforming underrepresented voices, transcending linguistic barriers, and experimenting with format and genre, apart from being a worthy goal in of itself, it's also what audiences really want. And the fact that we do all these things, I think, is why we're so important to the media space in this region. So the last point I want to make about the value I think that we bring as an organization is the fact that we are a media movement. And as Tammy was saying, she wanted to talk to us because we are both activists and media outlets. And our specific kind of goal and our political purpose as an organization is to inform, empower, and advocate. And through this kind of political mission, I think we're really able to publish stories that have a significant and tangible impact on the ground, on the places that we are, writing stories about. And to illustrate this, I'm going to use another example, actually using a story that I personally worked on. So I will share that now. So this is a piece that I did for New Narrative. It's called We Can't Just Sit Still, Malaysian Cleaners Protest Amidst Pandemic. And it's actually a follow-up piece on a documentary that I did in 2019, which you can see the poster for here, called Bila Kami Bersatu, which means When We Are One in Malay. And this is a documentary about hospital cleaners in Malaysian government hospitals unionizing to fight for higher wages. So the idea for this documentary came from a New Narrative brainstorming session. I continued working with the union into this year as well, even after the film was created. And then in July of this year, I published the aforementioned article, which you can see here again, on the New Narrative site. And this article focused on 5 organizers from the union who were arrested in July for protesting against poor working conditions that hospital cleaners were facing in the pandemic. So the article actually ended up being picked up by mainstream media along with the film, which you can see here. This is a Tamil newspaper that is discussing the activists. Even a quite well-known news aggregator site, kind of like the BuzzFeed of Malaysia, called says.com, they republished my article on their site. I mean, it's not, they didn't credit me or anything, but they did share the story to a wider audience. And I think this increased public attention and media attention really brought to light the issues that the union were facing to a wider audience, and actually put a lot of pressure on the police to answer for their trumped up charges against the unionists. And as a result, only a few weeks ago, all 5 unionists were actually cleared of all charges and are now walking free and ready to get back to their work of organizing. And I bring up this story not because I think that, the article and the film were the sole causes for, this amazing political outcome happening, but I do really believe that they were significant factors. And to me, that's the real beauty of New Narrative, because every so often we are able to see these tangible political outcomes from the work that we do, positive outcomes. And another example I'll quickly give is this year with the Singaporean elections, where the opposition gained the largest share of seats in parliament since 1966. And we did extensive coverage on the elections. We are one of the only independent media outlets in Singapore. And I do believe that our work made a difference partially because the Singaporean government keeps coming after our managing director, PJ, which to me is proof enough that the stuff we do does rile them and it does make a difference. So all of this is just to say, I do believe the biggest value that we do bring as a media organization is how we are able to do that process of inform, educate, inform, empower, and advocate. We are able to translate stories and ideas into tangible political change and action. And that's pretty much it from me. And thank you so much again for attending this conference.
Thank you so much, Minxi. That was beautiful. And I put the website in the chat. Of course, we should all know the addresses of the 3 host outlets today, but newnarative.com. Please check it out and become a member. All right, our second speaker is Brian Hu. Brian Hu is one of the founding editors of New Bloom, which, as I said earlier, focuses on Taiwan, but beyond as well. As a freelance writer, Brian covers social movements and politics. He's also quite a good photographer in my view, and he's also a translator. Welcome, Brian.
Hey everybody, so I'm Brian, pronouns he, him. I'll just start the screen sharing because I have a PowerPoint. And how do I do this? Okay, so I'll just talk a bit about New Bloom and how we started and how we see our mission and what we're trying to do at present. So New Bloom was founded in 2014. We were actually a direct offshoot of the Sunflower Movement. The Sunflower Movement was the student-led occupation of the Taiwanese legislature for about a month in protest of a free trade agreement with China. It's feared that this would have a deleterious effect on political freedoms in Taiwan, particularly regarding the media, freedom of expression, that this would contribute to self-censorship, and so forth. And so we were very interested in articulating a left-wing perspective on the movement, but also engaging in international outreach. We had the view that the issues which the movement sought to address were not just country to country, not just an issue of Taiwan and China, but pointed to larger structural issues regarding capitalism, neoliberalism, free trade agreements, globalization, and so forth. And so to really address these issues, it was necessary to build a platform that would conduct dialogue and facilitate dialogue between Taiwan and the international world to really address these issues. And so then that's what became New Bloom originally. So it went to be bilingual, that eventually became primarily English language, to focus on social movements, politics, as well as youth culture, and we publish daily, sometimes more. We have kind of 2 organizational centers, which is Taipei and New York City. And it's really about 30 individuals, though it really fluctuates depending on who's active. And we're run entirely through crowdfunding. It's not a commercial enterprise, and we just kind of run it at our own expense. And now it's freezing. And so, yeah, the attempt is made to link Taiwan with the international world regarding these issues. We try to have more in-depth reporting and analysis on Taiwan, Taiwanese politics and culture. And so articles tend to be more long form, more in-depth, and we try to really have a more local perspective, because I think particularly when you see a lot of the writing on Taiwan in English, it's not actually by Taiwanese people. And it's actually very often from this distant analytic perspective, rather than allowing for the perspectives of people that are on the ground and their kind of thoughts and feelings about political issues to really come to the fore. And I think in general, for Taiwan, because Taiwan is not acknowledged by the majority of the world's nations, and it is fairly obscure. And so I think that kind of lack of information has contributed to misunderstandings of Taiwan. Particularly on the global left, I think that there is sometimes just the view of Taiwan that is caught decades ago, for example, viewing Taiwan as this right-wing dictatorship backed by the US and American empire, when that was actually Taiwan from decades ago. That's not how it is now. And Taiwan has seen a democracy movement to democratize, and there's a very vibrant civil society and a number of left-wing activists that are really hoping to push for international ties. And so particularly one of the things we really want to do in the beginning is to have much more bilingual translations, to have dialogue happening in this way, translating Chinese language articles into English and English language articles into Chinese. Taiwan, again, just generally suffers from a lack of English language reporting, but there's actually just a need to do beyond that too, to actually have local perspectives being a perspective between activists on the ground here and elsewhere being exchanged and so forth. And so then we see ourselves filling a gap in kind of what exists now in the media landscape. At the same time, compared to other outlets, we see ourselves as openly partisan in a sense. We have our viewpoints. We are left-wing. We are pro-independence. And this, again, comes from our background in the Sunflower Movement. And I think we thought that it was kind of better to be much more open about our political viewpoints than try to conceal this behind some kind of veneer of objective journalism. And again, this was providing information, but also being a platform for perspectives to be exchanged. And so this is an early meeting. And so then who are we? Then our team is mostly Taiwanese in some form. In the beginning, we were actually mostly students. For example, during the Sunflower Movement, I just graduated college. And so we were people that were, for example, part of groups such as the translation group of the movement. And eventually after the movement, we started talking about ways to continue that kind of work, but also expand, and particularly to how to inject a left-wing viewpoint into things. And so the youngest members are college students, the oldest are probably around 40. There are kind of some demographics that are quite visible in the organization. There are people that have are graduate students pursuing their PhDs, artists, particularly filmmakers. But the team is just generally bilingual. And originally we actually did have links to one student group that was part of the movement. A lot of people are drawn from the philosophy of mind department at National Yangming University, which is very much a medical school. And so even now during some of the events we do, people are like, why are there so many doctors here? That's one of the quirks of how we founded. And it is because of the fact that we were making connections during the movement between people we knew. Oftentimes there were people that had experience in the US and Taiwan. And so that led to kind of two organizational centers around Taipei and New York specifically. And that has sometimes led to some limitations because of this kind of geographic centering. But then actually, particularly now, we see more people moving back, I think particularly because of COVID. And so in New York, actually, we do have less people at present. And so projects that we're working on now, 6 years later, we're trying to open a physical space in Taipei. We don't really need an office, though this could be an office. So we're hoping this to be kind of an art space, as well as zine library, place for music events. As a joint project with other groups, because we can't really occupy the space, which you see in this picture, on our own. Botanic Products is one of these projects. It's trying to link Taiwan, Okinawa, Japan, Hong Kong, other countries in the Asia Pacific caught between America and China. The Ivy Palace, which is a former art space in Taipei, or some of the people are involved in that rather. And so we just kind of really want to have a physical space because we think that's the way to build more local roots at present, to actually build a community. And we think that's the way to perhaps mobilize in the future, because I think having an online presence as a media outlet, eventually we did run to certain limits regarding expanding or finding new writers, or really to being able to facilitate the kind of exchanges we were hoping to do in the beginning. And so depending on how you look at it, if you look at only English language media outlets, we are probably the largest English language independent media outlet writing on Taiwan currently. In terms of bilingual media outlets, we also are probably, we're still the largest independent media outlet. There are commercial outlets out there that are larger, but just I think the niche that we occupy in Taiwan did allow us to grow to the size. And that's one of these kind of unusual things because there's just lacking, I think, coverage on Taiwan in the international world. Some other projects currently include doing an English language oral history archive of the White Terror. We previously had a project that was an oral history of the Sunflower Movement, which is around 400,000 words. It's available online. I have a link to it at the end of this presentation. And we're also hoping to diversify efforts into other forms of media. We did want to become, have different formats in the beginning, but eventually there was this kind of focus on the online publication. And so podcasting as well, and we do have a podcast that appears sporadically. Print zines is another thing that we're trying to work on, and also producing more video content. So here's some photos of events. And yeah, and so here's the information to the different platforms we're on: social media, our website, also just the Daybreak project, which is our oral history project on the Sunflower Movement. And so particularly with a conference such as this, I think it's very rare to have the opportunity to engage in dialogue with publications that are similar. I just think that there is not usually the effort to conduct actually and build a transnational media outlet. I think that that is inherently one of the challenges. Particularly most media outlets do operate on this very national basis in which it focuses on the issues of one place, one nation, or one locality. And actually conducting dialogue and thinking beyond that, thinking beyond borders, I think is very difficult. There are inherent logistical challenges just in running that. For example, when there are actually not a lot of good formats, for example, for running a website in more than one language, to actually have more than one language featured on the same website rather than just have it parsed out between different sections. And so creating this is just, I think there are certain uphill challenges to it. I'm really looking forward to discussing that with everybody going forward.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. It's wonderful to see what New Bloom's working on these days. Our third panelist is Ah Boat, and our friend Ah Boat today is wearing a mask and using a pseudonym for safety. She is a writer from Hong Kong who translates for Lausan, And she also works in the US media, and she will be telling us about her work and what Lausan's philosophy and projects are right now. Welcome, Abot.
Hi, everyone. As you can see, I am just anonymized because I am a permanent resident. I actually am a national of Hong Kong. And so a lot of the work that I do with Lausan has political repercussions immediately for me and the rest of my family, because I am from Hong Kong, as Tammy mentioned. And if you're here on this panel, I think I don't need to explain how terrible things are back home. So good times. Let me just share with you my screen. So as Tammy mentioned, I am part of the Lausan Collective, which is a transnational left collective that also has a publication and also does a lot of different organizing projects. So as you can probably tell, the term collective itself is already contains a lot of ambiguity. We do a lot of long form features, different translations of like shorter articles, in a general bid to present a different version of Hong Kong to the world, because the general narrative of Hong Kong has usually been one of neoliberal capture, where there's been a lot of emphasis on the former colonized state of Hong Kong and sort of like, ooh, look at them intermix between the East and the West, and not much else really. There's no real sort of sense or attention by foreign news outlets to the sort of intricacies and battles between the local people and the government there. So it's worth pointing out that Lausan actually started as a WhatsApp group. It was formed in the wake of the July 21st attacks last year. And basically, a lot of people who were tweeting diaspora not about the Hong Kong protests found one another on Twitter, and basically just like it all started off as a group to sort of mutually comfort over the sort of police brutality that was happening in Hong Kong, and it slowly devolved into something bigger. We started off wanting to do a reading list to better educate people about the sort of complicated history, the colonial project that Hong Kong was for Imperial Britain, and the current as city that is like a conduit for international capital. So Lausan itself is actually stands for, well, people who speak Chinese sometimes say that it stands for Leaky Umbrella, but really what it actually means is that it's like dispersed umbrellas. It's sort of a reference to the fact that a lot of our members are diaspora. They are like moving back and forth between different countries. And here I have to say that even though Lausan talks a lot about Hong Kong, we were actually founded by, well, there are no founders, only members. This is an ethic that we are committed to, that every single person who participates in this project is a really valued member and worker and organizer participating in like the politics that we actually want to see in the world. But it is worth pointing out that we, like the sort of like group that was in the WhatsApp group, it was already composed of different diasporas beyond the Hong Kong diaspora. We have Taiwanese members, we had mainland Chinese members. And so the sort of ideological makeup and the sort of ethnic makeup was already diverse from the get-go. We have people from a lot of different left tendencies, with a dedicated anarchist like group in Lausan. We have a bunch of you know, like people who like vary across the left spectrum, all wanting to build a better Hong Kong and build a better world, which is very, very important. So what exactly do we do? We write, we translate, and we organize. That is sort of like the core of what the collective does. We really and truly believe that left solidarity is important and is impossible without a dedicated internationalism. We believe that Hong Kong is a really good site from which we can apply like a actual radical left analysis to the sort of problems that we are all unfortunately interconnected by. We're talking about neoliberalism, we're talking about capitalism, we're talking about different ways in which globalization has led to the exploitation of many migrant workers, and the fact that the real internationalism that exists currently is the internationalism of capitalism, where people can just move their capital, their workers, and literally whatever across borders really quickly. And we see Hong Kong as a site for that, where, in this sort of city where domestic workers are paid literally about $1,000 US a month to work overtime to maintain these different Hong Kongers' houses, that Hong Kong is a site from which we can approach all of these big global questions. And so from Hong Kong, we move broader. So we have different articles, as you can see, about the interconnections between struggles between Hong Kong and the rest of the world. One piece that I would like to highlight is an original article by one of our members, JN, with another member, Simone, from an anarchist collective in the Philippines. So we are trying to do a lot more collaborations between different groups from different countries across Asia to really think through what a transnational left analysis could look like, what that transnational left collaboration could look like. And another thing that we find that is very important is translation. Like what Minxi said, translation is an issue of accessibility, but to me personally, it is a form of political praxis. How can you build transnational left solidarity if your analysis cannot cross linguistic borders? And so there's a lot of interchange and a lot of information sharing through this act of translating not just from Cantonese or Mandarin to English, and then from English to Bahasa Indonesian or Spanish or French or Korean. There's also that translation back, into Cantonese, into different, back into Hong Kong. So there's this sort of constantly circulating economy of ideas, if you will. And something that we are very insistent on is that our work should not be limited to just writing and just editing, even though this is extremely important, especially since there has not been a concerted left consensus on Hong Kong. As you can tell, there are a lot of people who still believe that the CCP is an actual socialist state, and there's a lot of internecine debates about whether or not we should support Hong Kong or support basically the indigenous peoples and different religious ethnic minority groups in China from being persecuted by an Islamophobic government. So how do we convince our readers, or how do we encourage and empower our readers into people who actually do something politically, not just for Hong Kong, but every single place wherever they are? And so another thing that Lausan does that I think is really important is that it is trying to offer and build a viable alternative, a viable left alternative to the status quo. So we've been doing a lot of different events, like panels like this. I took a nice little graphic from a Versal panel that we did late last year. We do different webinars, activist exchanges between, for example, BLM organizers and organizers in Hong Kong. We more and more do in-person live actions. So it is getting harder and harder because of the pandemic. As the picture here shows, this is an action that we did in California in front of the Chinese embassy. So we also did a in-person rally in New York for July 1st against national security law. And something that Lausan wants to do a lot more is to really build out our organizing arm as well as our editorial arm, offer original, concrete left analysis of the sort of issues facing Hong Kong moving forward, but also different countries like Singapore, like Indonesia, Taiwan. And the other thing that we would really like to do moving forward is political education. We truly see that the rest of our like media collective partners, we really truly do believe that informing and educating people is like one of the few ways that we can actually build political power. And so this is something that we are really trying to do, which is also why there's like an ambiguity as to like what Lausan is. And it's really hard to sort of explain to people. The New York Times called us a group. So pretty strange and funny really to sort of like think about the ways in which we are breaking what a sustainable media collective looks like, and to what an organization that is not wary of accusations of ideological sort of like insistence on the ideological, because we are not interested from shying away from problems of power. And this is at the core of everything that we do. So yeah, just a little sweet intro. Happy to share more during the Q&A. But yeah, we are completely volunteer run. We are on, I want to say, 3 different continents. We have about at least 30 members now, not including community members. And we're trying to expand and grow and be an actual political force. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for that, Albert, and for participating despite your security concerns. Really appreciate your being here. Just a note to encourage people to message everyone in the chat or promise Lee or me directly if you have questions for our panelists today. I might start with one of my own, and then I will take your guys's. So one question I had that I wanted to hear a little bit more about was the language work, because I know that all 3 of your outlets are trying to make a real effort to translate, to write stuff originally in languages that are not English, but of course we're all still sort of, mostly working in English. So can you say a little bit about, how you're doing that work and kind of what that looks like, and whether new people have been brought in through that process? And just to keep things moving, just for everybody to know, we'll just do very quick Q&As up until the hour. And then after that, for the people who can stay, we'll have a bit of a more in-depth discussion for a bit. Thank you. So Minxi, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So as of now, our team, there's quite a number of languages that are already represented within our team, which is about, I think as of now, it's 13 people. So for example, even within Malaysia, most people are at least bi or even trilingual. We have Malay, English, Mandarin, Tamil as the 4 kind of main languages that are spoken. And then we have people in Indonesia. So we have Bahasa Indonesia on our team as well. We have someone who's based in Cambodia who, they don't speak Khmer, but they have contacts with Khmer translators. So we kind of work with a lot of freelancers right now in terms of getting translations for our pieces. We try to translate at least 1 piece per week. And I think our ultimate goal is to really be able to have internally a network of people working at New Naratif who are able to speak, all the main languages across Southeast Asia. Like I said, this is pretty difficult because there are 11 countries and sometimes multiple languages per country, especially when you start looking at minority kind of languages and communities. But that's really our ultimate goal, is to have that network within the New Naratif team. But until we can reach that very, very maybe far away goal, we continue to work with freelancers based in the region. Yeah.
Thank you. Brian, what about New Bloom? How are you guys handling the question of languages?
That's right. And so when New Bloom was founded, actually, it was originally intended to be completely bilingual. So each section, the Chinese language section and the English section, was supposed to be equal size. However, as time went on, the English section grew larger and the Chinese language section grew smaller, and eventually one sort of swallowed the other. And that's actually been one of the challenges, particularly. I think that part of it is really what was lacking in terms of the existing ecosystem was English language writing. And particularly if a writer that was writing in Chinese wanted to pitch to us or another publication, us versus a different publication, it would actually, you could get more circulation if you pitched to the other publication. So you would pitch to us if you want it translated in English, and that started affecting the kind of content we got, and eventually that kind of shifted the direction of how things went. So in an ideal world, both section would still be equally large, and I think that they would actually have a little separate editorial direction, but then it ended up becoming sort of like collapsed together, and that's one of the issues. And so that being the case, we also do really want to expand to other languages. We did have a deal in the past with a publication to translate articles into Spanish, and I also did translate some of their articles into English for us, which were then translated to Chinese. So then, that's also another one of the challenges, that when you're dealing with multiple languages, sometimes it is this kind of a game in which you have to have translation to one language and another language and so forth. That's actually still one of the efforts we work on currently. We actually, with our print version, which comes out sporadically and is mostly kind of a zine or a small magazine, we're trying to build more transnational connections, and we're hoping to actually circulate this more, particularly in East and Southeast Asia. And this sometimes just depends on which languages that our members happen to have. And in many cases, particularly, we do have a member that's very good with Japanese. And so that's one of the reasons why we do have this kind of focus now on doing print versions, and probably there will be some content in Japanese. If not for COVID, we would have had our first event outside of Taiwan and the US in Okinawa, actually, particularly to build ties with the self-determination movement there in April, but that just didn't happen because of COVID. And so that's just one of those things.
Great, thank you for that, Brian. And what about you, Abbo? What does translation and working in different languages look like at Lausan?
Actually, this addresses a little bit of Lina's question. So translation, right, is not just, well, we have a dedicated sort of community of translators which is why I think it's really important to just keep on noting that unlike a lot of mainstream media or journalism organizations where there's a valorization of the individual over the collective, like Lausan is truly only sustained by a large group of people. This includes our translators. So we have a lot of different people who just literally step up and say, hey, there are, I am studying like Bahasa Indonesian. Can I like use this opportunity to practice my, Bahasa and just, translate this article that I think would really resonate with like friends there. So we have like, because it's like that sort of volunteer, we have a lot of different languages on our site from, the big sort of like major languages, major here, from German to French to Spanish, and then Korean is definitely another one. All of these different sort of like people who have the capacity and who have the generosity to share their language skills and use it for this purpose. But another thing that I think like how translation works with Lausan specifically is that we really generally do want to highlight both mainland Chinese and Hong Kong left perspectives. So what that means is that we really do try and have been trying to set up different sort of republishing or translation agreements with different left outlets in Hong Kong. So we've had like a good partnership, informal partnership with like the Owl, which is a Hong Kong based sort of left outlet. And then another thing that we've been trying to do a lot more is that we've been trying to translate a lot more perspectives from mainland China. There are a lot of different sort of, obviously the left is different everywhere, different factions, but there are new sort of left media outlets, like leftist media outlets in mainland China that deserve to be more broadly like read. And one of the reasons why that people don't know about them or don't read about them is because of the language barrier. Not that many people can read Chinese. And so one thing that Lausan tries to do, right, in all of these different cases is to say, hey, like, I can speak Chinese. I personally speak both Mandarin and Cantonese. Like, how can I deploy these skills that I have acquired because of my heritage or whatever, or schooling? How can I deploy this and try to encourage and facilitate that transnational, actually cross-border information sharing, and of course, solidarity and building power that way. So yeah, that would be my answer for Lausan.
Thank you so much, Abbo. Appreciate it. I've gotten a few private messages that center around the question of US and China. And given that we're all kind of operating in a sort of Asian sphere and just generally in the world, we're dealing with these two hegemons. Could each of you guys talk just briefly about how you guys see yourselves positioned between China and the US and how you try to escape the sort of, the grasp of this kind of nationalistic impulse in building the solidarity that you do? We'll start with Brian, please.
Yeah, that's right. So Taiwan is particularly caught between the US and China. For years, for decades, the US backed Chiang Kai-shek and his son Chiang Ching-kuo as dictators in following the traditional pattern of backing right-wing dictators to oppose a quote-unquote communist country. And so then after that, Taiwan democratized, but the US does still continue to back Taiwan as a sort of wedge against China. And so for us, particularly with New Bloom, is that what we were really trying to do is to push for a critique of both. We believe that self-determination for Taiwan necessarily involves being critical of both the US and China, not just blindly relying on American power to oppose China and that kind of thing. And particularly in that sense, we want to build solidarity with movements in both China and America to really push for solidarity between people's movements rather than relying on these state actors who at the end of the day really have just, are just trying to use you for their own geopolitical ends. And so that's been a challenge, I think, particularly in terms of trying to carve out the perspective. That's really why we were formed out of the Sunflower Movement. That's the perspective we wanted to articulate in the movement. And I think that it has been heartening that there are particularly young people that are increasingly critical of the US, but this has been a longstanding issue in Taiwan, that there's this historical idealization of the US, seeing US in a very rose-tinted lens. And you can see that now, particularly in the Trump administration, because of the Trump-Tsai phone call shortly after Trump won the presidency. There's just been idealization of America in Taiwan and of the Trump administration specifically in Taiwan, viewing it as the most pro-Taiwan administration in history and that kind of thing. And so we're really trying to push for this critique of that. And sometimes it does come from this place of unawareness of what happens in the US, or even a place of privilege, just not actually experiencing the state violence that occurs in the US on a daily basis, having a kind of position of privilege in which you don't have to grapple with that. And so then actually just trying to make people aware of this, these are the kind of dialogues we're trying to facilitate. But it does actually mean fighting out a lot of different groups, for example. The pro-unification left, people that are idealizing China and call for Taiwan to be unified with China on that ground. And the pro-independence right, people that are pro-independence but have right-wing social values or take a kind of back on state actors in order to realize that. And so kind of, we really saw ourselves as trying to create a path or develop a path for a pro-independence left. And that's the project I think that the New Bloom exists for the purpose of.
Great, thanks for that. Minxi?
Oh, sorry, just unmuted. This is quite an interesting question for us in Southeast Asia, because obviously our kind of immediate proximity politically to the US and China is not necessarily as overt as in Hong Kong and Taiwan, but there is a very strong influence there. I mean, the Philippines, for example, was a US colony. Many people forget about this. And currently, you know, Cambodia and a lot of countries in that area are being very influenced by Chinese capital, and it's having a very tangible environmental and ecological effect in the dams that are being built on the Mekong River, et cetera. So for us, I think the question really is to kind of try and recenter Southeast Asians as the focus of our coverage. Because if you look at a lot of coverage about Southeast Asia in the international sphere, it is about kind of contextualizing it within these larger power structures. And Southeast Asia, you know, as countries, we're kind of, most of us are considered to be quite small, insignificant, couldn't find us on a map. You know, that's kind of the perception of a lot of the countries in our space. And that's just simply something that we're really trying to push against. So we want to say, look, there's so much more to Cambodia than just it being a site for hydropower dams for China. Or even if we want to look at hydropower dams, are we just interviewing real estate developers that are based in China, or are we going to actually interview, you know, the Cambodians who live and work on the Mekong River and are being displaced because of this construction? So to us, that's the kind of tactic that we try to take in dealing with us being in the midst of all these big political kind of issues that actually, you know, don't center our personal experiences as Southeast Asians.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. And Abo, can you talk about Lausan in the US-China hegemonic mix?
The funny thing about Lausan is like we've very much like been very strongly from the get-go. We're very much like against both Washington and Beijing. This is like a core belief of the collective, which is that certainly we have to understand and keep on like hammering in our analysis, which is that the current tensions between US and China are manifestations of a rivalry competition between two competing capitalist and frankly imperialist powers who are vying in the sort of ruins of the world as they deal with their own like overproduction like crises. So with that analysis in mind, the sort of only alternative, right, is to build something that is not that, literally anything but that. Now, if you're a tanky or someone who really believes in a multipolar world, you would say, well, this is the point where we have to choose sides. Like, we have to support the CCP in their sort of like capitalist rivalry against China, against the US. But if you're someone like us, like the people who are on this panel, or even just like anybody who's like basically trapped within the sort of like, again, capitalist imperialist rivalry, you say, no, I don't want to play. I don't want to do any of this. And you build power elsewhere. Now, the question that has been sort of like an intention that we've been trying to explore as a collective and the sort of things that we do in both editorial work and in organizing is to say, well, how can that actually work when our governments are completely like bought into the sort of the reality of this imperial rivalry. And so a lot of the steps that we do is to just say, keep on this sort of political perspective, which is we are what makes our government and we are what makes this world keep like continue to go. So that means a lot of different things, right? That means, you know, stepping back from the sort of like increasing Cold War rhetoric in the US, if you're in the US, which I unfortunately am. I came here to the metropole for many different reasons, but I'm here. And you just try to build power in wherever you are and try to connect with people who are elsewhere. That sounds really sort of vague, but that is the only thing that we can do. That is the only political horizon that is sustainable, and that is a political vision that we are trying to push for.
Thanks so much for that, Albo. Really appreciate it. So just a quick time check. So we have about 4 or 5 minutes left before the hour, at which point I know some of us have to leave. We will be staying for about 10 or 15 minutes afterward to do a couple more questions. But let me just take one last question to close us out, because it's about solidarity. And so to address the organizing aspect of each of your outlets, one of our participants wants to know, how do you define solidarity and how do you practice it within your organizations? Albo, actually, do you want to start this time?
It means not just saying things. Like from me personally, it means not just saying shit. So from a personal perspective, I actually, I do a lot of translating for Lausan, and I used to be much more involved with editorial work as we started. But right now, for me, my personal priority is political education. So it means like, you know, just really like, not just, so one thing that we do is internal political education, right? So teaching people, like basically within our members across borders, just sort of educating one another on issues that are going in our respective sort of like countries, but also it means reaching out to our base, which is where Lausan is more of like an organizing project than it is a media outlet where we actually try to reach out to people. One such thing, without doxing myself, one such thing that we try to do is having community workshops in different cities. It's been much harder because of COVID, but it literally means just talking to community members and trying to reach out to local organizations and building connections from there. That's what solidarity looks like for us. So what that means, right, is specifically for New York City, like going to the Asians for Abolition events, standing out with the Black Lives Matter movement, really making that work, like doing that community work of talking to maybe community elders who might not be immediately invested or are too afraid to join in support of Black lives. And just sort of like going back and forth again with that translation barrier. So in a nutshell, actual concrete organizing work, which sucks, but is necessary.
Yeah, it's the hardest work. Minxi, what about you? What about New Narrative? How does it define solidarity?
I feel like Abu really summarized it perfectly in saying it's getting shit done. It's really about the kind of the effort and the actions that you put in, the labor that you put in. Not just, I guess I could talk a little bit, more about how we define it as, like transcending these barriers, these borders that are designed by society to kind of keep us apart. So whether this is, nationhood or gender or race, these are all constructions that are created to divide us, and part of our solidarity work is to overcome them and to see how they are very arbitrary, and our personal liberations are tied to a greater political liberation. But I also think that there's an aspect of solidarity that's like internal, especially towards your own team. So for us, we're a very small team, about 13 people. We all work at New Naratif full time. New Naratif is a membership funded organization. So we do take grants and donations, but the bulk of our funding actually comes from our community and our members. And because of this, we kind of, we recognize that we are part of this movement and this great, amazing community that's materially supporting us. And to us, that's also kind of part of our solidarity, where we want to take care of our own community. We want to take care of each other and ourselves. So I think there's quite a actually like emotional aspect to it too that really gets overlooked, because to me, solidarity it's not just about political action, but it's about really like caring about your fellow man, right? Like caring about the people that are in the struggle with you, that are helping you, and hopefully receiving that care in return, and receiving that sense of solidarity amongst them. So that's all from me.
Thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. And Brian, New Bloom and solidarity work.
Yeah, so I would just echo the comments that have been said previously. What I would just add to that is that I think particularly a lot of the issues that we're grappling with on a quote unquote national level are actually transnational in roots. And so I think a lot of it is pointing to how these issues cannot be solved just on the basis of one nation state or a movement in one place. It really does require a transnational movement and trying to build towards that. And so I think a lot of times solidarity work then does involve also pointing to how that is so and where that is the case, and how a coalition action or collective action on a transnational basis is what allows for addressing these issues. Because I think particularly in the past few years, just during New Bloom, a lot of the comments which come up is people are like, well, what is the point of the solidarity work? Why are you spending all this time on this kind of abstraction of this thing that we can't see, building ties with people that we don't directly come in contact with? What is the utility of that? And I think then, I mean, that's oftentimes these are people that call for relying on state actors, whereas we are calling for building ties with other social movements and social movement actors and activists and that kind of thing. So I think sometimes it is articulating then what does solidarity do? And I think that's on multiple levels. One is emotional support, because actually when you're in a movement, in a cause, it is something that's very tiring. It does feel very exhausting, and having that sense of connection with other people, being part of a common cause, can actually be tremendously powerful. And that's something that I think is very important. But B, then, as I mentioned, just these are issues that none of us can address alone. It's only together that we can address them. And so I think that's where solidarity work is key, and I would really hope to see more of that.
Great, thank you for that. So we're at time, and if people need to log off, I just want to thank you so much for sharing this hour with us and for supporting these outlets. I'm going to put again the websites and a code from New Naratif in the chat, so please do visit and support our host outlets. But as I mentioned, I think we're going to proceed with about 15 more minutes of discussion for people who can stay. There's so many good questions. I'm trying to consolidate them into very similar ones. And so I'm going to group 3 questions together that deal with the issue of infrastructure and kind of movement building or outlet building. And so this question is about, how did you set up your outlets? How do you fund them is the second part. And the third part is, who do you welcome into them and how? How do you recruit? Can young people get involved? Can some of the people on this call get involved, and how? I'll start with you, Minxi.
Yeah, so just to kind of recap, I did mention this earlier, we are a membership funded organization. We do take grants and donations, but the bulk of our funding is from people who sign up for memberships. And we decided to go with this model because if you look at trends across media, membership funding really is the kind of future. Everybody's kind of trying to hop on it now, but we were on it in 2017, so thinking ahead of the curve. And the reason for this is because, you know, we want to make sure that our work is completely free of advertising and free of being influenced by external interests. So even for our grants and donations, we have a very strict editorial policy, ethics policy, where we will not take money from anyone who wants to influence anything that we post on our site or any of the views that we purport. So that's kind of the funding side of it. In terms of the infrastructure, we started out as a kind of looser collective that was started, I was not part of the original founding team. That was PJ Thum, who is our managing director, Kirsten Han, who was our editor-in-chief, and Sonny Liu, who is a comic book artist, and all three of them were based in Singapore, and they kind of started it out as a kind of looser collective. But as time went on, we kind of found that we needed to get a bit more professional just because of how much work was going into it. And also it was the amount of work where we couldn't really maintain day jobs outside of running the site. So over time, as our memberships grew and we were bringing in, you know, more money, we were able to start paying people to do things full time. So I'm full-time employed at New Naratif now. And that's kind of the direction that we are gonna be going down. And what's the last question? Oh, how people can get involved. So obviously, you know, if you want to support us and get involved, the best way to do so is to join as a member and pay my salary, but also to kind of make sure that we can continue producing content and make sure that we can continue doing all the good work that we're doing. But you can also come to any of our open meetings. We have them once a month and they're completely for free. And we should also be starting up a series of democracy classrooms in the coming months. I'm doing a democracy classroom tomorrow, so hopefully I'll see some of you there and you can learn more about what a democracy classroom is. And New Naratif is really open to anyone. You know, we're very Southeast Asian centered, but anyone who wants to learn more about Southeast Asia, who wants to maybe see how they can situate themselves within Southeast Asian politics or culture is really welcome to join. I think it's the most fascinating region in the world. I am biased, but if any of you would like to learn more about it, please do come onto our site and read the free articles we have there. We also have members only articles, which you can access, you know, once you join as a member. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Brian, any further notes on infrastructure, and then how do you fund yourselves and how can people get involved?
So this is actually, I think, one of the very interesting questions, particularly when it comes to building transnational efforts, because we actually ran into barriers, for example, funding ourselves because of this. We are funded entirely by crowdfunding, but for example, what crowdfunding platform do you choose? We're currently on Vocus, which is a Taiwan-specific platform. You can't really use it outside of Taiwan. And so that actually kind of limits then who is funding us. And then so in that choice, the choice of platform sometimes depends on where your readership is coming from. And so if we went with something like, I don't know, Patreon or Kickstarter or Indiegogo, that might have more appeal outside of Taiwan, but then Taiwanese people are probably not being able to get on those outlets. And so that's one of the challenges. And I think that the New Bloom is not, doesn't have any full-time staff. We're all volunteers, that includes me. And so we just have had to manage it on that basis for all this time. But then I think then particularly there are all these inherent issues with running a transnational publication, such as, for example, even just organizing a meeting. What is the best time that works for everybody? And people are spread out across so many different time zones. Even just organizing this conference is an example of that. And so I think these are particularly interesting questions to get into as the week goes on, because just there are so many challenges regarding running a kind of publication. And there's so few examples, I think, of publications that really try to do this, or organizations and so forth. And so those are, I think, questions very much worth exploring and discussing more.
Great, thank you for that. And what about you, Abo? What's Lausan thinking on these issues?
As I sort of already alluded to, we started off as a WhatsApp group, and we're just like spinning out of control, trying to figure out in terms of sustainability. Because like literally how we fund like Lausan, how we like pay for our domain, it's literally just people donating, like our members just like, you know, like maybe getting like taking like 20% of like, you know, like a check that they got for writing a piece and then dumping it into the bucket. And then just like sort of trying to scrape the money together and keep going. And so something that we have been trying to figure out is, should we have a bank account? Should we actually like launch a fundraising campaign? Should we have like a page, like a Patreon or like a Venmo that people can send money to in order to finance our operations? Because we are 100% volunteer, right? But then there's a just editorial work, or can we divert the funds to our organizing work? So that's a lot of different questions that we've been trying to grapple with, instead of just like, you know, basically just like struggling with like $0 and just like pushing it forward out of like a sense of love and solidarity and rage. Rage is very important. As for
are you guys taking donations now though?
Okay, here's a problem. We don't have a bank account right now. So like literally this is something that we are literally trying to figure out. But if you want to like send us money, you can just email us, and I guess we can just figure it out. I guess at this point we don't have like we have a lot of like internal questions, and we literally just like started a finance committee. So I will be able to give you more details in the upcoming days. But as how you guys can join or participate or do a lot of things. I just posted the contact page for different sort of varying things. It's not included on there, but if you want to send us money, please go for it. We will not say no. But a major thing that I want to sort of talk about that was important is that we are trying to do a lot more organizing, and there are a lot more buckets that like people can do. And so some of the different things that we've been doing is like transformative justice buckets, or which is something I'm personally very invested in and have been doing a lot of pushing for internal sort of education on, but like we are trying to do more in-person organizing projects. So there was an LA abolition reading group. And so like stuff like that. So like if you're interested at all and like just want to reach out to see if there are like any Lausan members in your city, like please do email us, and we can see if like, you know, there are people like maybe we can like have like an actual reading group again when like COVID ends. If this makes us sound like a lot more disorganized than we are. Actually, we are disorganized. I'm so sorry, but yeah, we're trying, you know, COVID, everything.
That's perfect. Thank you, Avo. Well, yeah, I feel like in a way, the attendance roster for this 4-day conference should be our network, right? For all of us. And hopefully we will be looking each other up when we go to KL or Sydney or, you know, Montana, where I am, or, you know, Taiwan. And so I just encourage us to stay in touch. And I think the organizers are going to work on, you know, some sort of way for us to continue the conversation beyond these 4 days. Let's try to squeeze in like 2 more quick questions before people wrap up. I'm going to collapse a couple of questions that centered on hard to reach populations in our organizing spheres. So, you know, how do you reach people, or do you reach people who are in Xinjiang, who are in West Papua, who are in Central Asia, who are indigenous to the areas that you're trying to organize in? What does that look like? What are the challenges? Maybe each of you could just give a quick example of trying to reach out to one of those groups that is less represented and maybe, you know, is blocked through language or geography. Brian, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the challenges, particularly if you want to build ties with groups, they have to know about you first. And so in many parts of the world, there is restricted access to information. And so then oftentimes in the past few years, my experience is when you do encounter groups, for example, Chinese activists or Xinjiang activists or whatever, you actually encounter them in somewhere, let's say New York or London or the Western world or places like that. These are more neutral spaces in which you can kind of, you're not as directly threatened by state surveillance, so you still have to be careful. And so I think these are sometimes the places in which you can actually make contact with these groups. And I think particularly for the role of diaspora, this is why there's such a crucial, this is something that really diaspora is maybe very suited for, because this is where these encounters can happen. They can't actually take place closer to home sometimes because of the danger level. And so I think this is something that is particularly the case with many publications and organizations. And I think historically it's also been the case. And I think these are kind of issues too that are worth considering for diaspora organizing going forward, actually.
Thanks for that. What about you, Minxi?
For us, actually, the biggest kind of question or maybe issue is not necessarily about being in politically tense, areas, but the issue of being digital altogether. So a lot of the populations that we want to report on, that we're trying to reach, they actually don't have access to, stable internet connection. They don't have access to, potentially even being able to read the site online. So for us, that's something that's a huge, consideration. And the way that we're trying to get around this, we've tried to get around this is by publishing things in, hard copy format as well. So we had a book that came out, and we've been trying to, we've been flirting the idea of doing a few comics compilations, a few zines, but it's quite difficult, especially now during COVID. We used to also have lots of in-person events all across the region so that we could really access these communities that don't have access to the digital space. So I'm hoping that we can really return to that, because for Southeast Asia, it's really very important to be able to talk to people face to face, because yeah, not everybody is able to even afford a computer or even a smartphone. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you so much. But what about Lausan and hard to reach or organized populations?
This accessibility is like a thing that we constantly are trying to enforce, but I really just want to emphasize Brian's answer, which is that diaspora is the place where those connections can happen. And that is the strength, I guess, of being dispersed. It is in diaspora where language barriers, and I mean the internet really has been, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the internet has been such an important tool for us, even as Minxi said, people, there are some people who don't have access to the internet, who don't have access to reliable working computers because of poverty, because of state control, or whatever it is that that closes them off from this wonderful world. But one thing that I think is really important, right, is again the point that I've been trying to sort of barrow through this entire talk, which is education. How can we reach people that we don't even know about or don't even know exist, right? So it's really a lot of education, a lot of humility, and a willingness to learn, and willingness to seek ground, especially in case of indigenous or first world nations peoples.
Great, thank you for that. So I'll try to make this my last question, although I feel like we've gotten so many interesting queries, which I'll pass along to the panelists, and maybe we can do a sort of email follow-up for stuff we didn't get to. But the last question for the evening is about sort of moving beyond the journalistic or nonfiction sphere into artistic production. We have an audience member who's curious about whether you guys are building relationships with artists and fiction writers, musicians, to do this work as well, and kind of what that looks like. Minxi mentioned a little bit about working with a comic artist, but perhaps there are other elaborations on that point. So Minxi, why don't you start and talk about New Narrative's relationship to art production?
Yes, I would absolutely love to. There's quite a few people on our team who are artists and writers. I myself am a fiction writer, and I think we always wanted to incorporate some level of cultural analysis in our work, because I think that art and culture really are the best mediums for the imagination. And imagination is so important to political discourse, because it's the only way that we are able to actually imagine a world that's different from our own. So we really wanted to incorporate that into our the stuff that we produce on our site. So we do have these comics, and our comics and illustrations editor is herself a artist, and she actually did she suggested this piece for us. She pitched this piece for us that ended up becoming another one of my favorite pieces on the site, which was an artist response piece. And this was basically, some of you may know that earlier this year in February, there was a coup that happened in Malaysia, and our previously democratically elected government, which had been, it was quite a huge success for us to have this government elected in 2018. It was actually overthrown in February of this year, and Karis commissioned a piece of a compilation of art pieces by political artists in Malaysia that had this kind of that showed the emotional response and the psychological response of how horrible this political event was for everybody. And I think it conveyed so much more than, you know, even a written article could, because you could really feel the emotion towards this political, you know, situation. And I really hope that we can continue to do more of that, maybe not just with illustrations and art, but also with fiction writing, with other forms of art, other you know, means of kind of really expressing this imagination and this emotional aspect of what we want our politics to be. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you. And we look forward to your novel too. Brian, what about you and New Bloom?
Yeah, so similarly, we actually do have a lot of members that are artists or photographers or musicians or filmmakers. And so something we're trying to do is figure out how to integrate that. I think because particularly we're lacking resources, it's very difficult for us to commission anything. And so integrating that into the publication has been somewhat difficult. And so that has taken forms now, such as video content or the zine that we try to produce now regularly. And there are also plans to kind of create a sort of creative nonfiction face to New Bloom, which are still in the works, but it'd be kind of another publication under the sort of New Bloom umbrella, in which this can actually be a platform for these kind of things. And then interrelating that with a kind of the Newsy website, which currently exists currently. And we also do have, as I mentioned during my presentation, we're working on an art space, and we're hoping that this can be a space to facilitate community, and that putting people, what they do normally in terms of their artistic practice, in dialogue with what exists in New Bloom can actually create a sense of community. I think that particularly because everyone's a volunteer, they might be doing their different projects on their own, but then putting it together as a group in connecting it with New Bloom and political work has been a little bit difficult. And so we've tried to do that in the past years by holding these kind of salon-style parties in which we have musical performances, you know, performance art, and just as a way to create a space, a gathering for people to interact with each other. And so this is something we're trying to work on still.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, it's my dream to visit that new space in Taipei someday. Great. And what about you, Appo? Can you talk about Lausan and your relationship to art and artists?
Sorry, I'm trying to find the thing that I'm referring to, but my computer is lagging. So we actually have a dedicated visual art, like a visual culture bucket slash sort of committee in the collective. We have a bunch of different artists, which is why like our website looks bomb. Like shout out to spf.jpg, which is how they would like to be referred to. Like really, we have a bunch of different sort of artists and people who are interested in art who are doing so much work within Lausan. But I just wanted to send you guys this. So we do participate in artistic production, even if it's not like prominently on our website. So this is a MoMA video that we presented for MoMA specifically on like as part of like an invitation for work. So so like we have a lot of different people who are participating in that artistic production, and we actually have a lot of exciting sort of art talks and projects that are coming up that I can't really talk about, but really just like keep an eye out for it. We're very excited about that. As I'm not to dox myself, but I am a writer. I write fiction and I do cultural criticism sometimes. And this is a question that I'm personally very interested in, which is how can literature or good literature be reflective of the politics, and whether that is possible or not, or whether there's going to be a productive tension in that. And this is something that I personally would like to explore, as like a lot of different artists in the collective already do with different mediums. Unfortunately, I cannot say like a longer answer without doxing myself, because my opinions will immediately out me. But yeah, shout out to the artists in our collective, and please do watch that MoMA video. It's actually very, very good.
Great, thank you for that. So I think we're going to wrap up for the day, but just a reminder that we have 3 more sessions as part of this conference. Thank you so much to the host institutions, New Bloom, Lausan, and New Naratif, and to Promise and Vincent, who's been feverishly live tweeting this. But thank you guys so much for spending this time with us. And we haven't forgotten the questions that didn't get answered. We're going to send those to the panelists, and we'll hope to see you tomorrow night. Thank you so much to Minxi and to Brian and to Oppo for their wisdom tonight. Thanks and good night or good morning.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, feel free to unmute and say bye.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. You were awesome.